Wroth out of wit. And I think part of it was the translation was so good that I enjoyed, some of the phrases. Anyway, all right, let's talk about. I mentioned fur. In addition to people hunting fur-bearing animals, especially in Europe, we think there was probably kind of a mini ice age around 1500. Temperatures got a lot cooler, and so people were hunting fur a lot more. And so by 1500, Europe's fur supply had really dwindled. And the Russians, to a certain extent, got in on the fur trade, but most of the furs came from North America. And most of that fur came from the French trappers, the Jacques Lauremines and the Ceron St. Brains and all those guys. The British traders, they moved into the Hudson's Bay area, they did all right. And the Dutch, in pursuit of fur, they moved into the New York area, present-day New York City. And when we look at New York City today, and there are some areas today that are strongly Dutch influenced, with Dutch names and Peter Stuyvesant and all those guys. What eventually evolved in the American fur trade was that the original guys who were trapping, they quit trapping and they started trading with the indigenous folks, with the tribes. The Hurons were around the Great Lakes. They were probably the kingpins of the fur trade. They're a large tribe, good at what they did, and I mean, come on, it's the Great Lakes. Incredible numbers of fur-bearing animals. It got to the point where the same thing was happening in the United States, or the colonies in North America. Hunting them to extinction. I mentioned that one of the reasons why beaver was so popular was because beaver hats. And they were all the rage. The reason we still got beaver running around in North America is because when silk came in, the beaver hat went out. But that was one of the things that for a while anyway, really drove world trade. Talk about that. Well, some of the implications and some of the repercussions of that were, one of them, that great dying we talked about. A lot of the indigenous people in North America died because of disease. They just weren't, they didn't have the defense mechanisms. They'd never been exposed to measles, smallpox, diphtheria, that kind of stuff. They went to them like a side. Another one is that the North, especially in North America, where most of the trade was taking place, the tribes became greatly dependent upon European traders. And this, to a certain extent, is going to change the whole way of life. I also mentioned that the Europeans introduced the horse to the Americans. Boy, did that change a lot of stuff. All of a sudden, they had a beast of burden that they could use.
I thought I heard at one point that the Native Americans showed how
Absolutely not.
Actually, the Native Americans freaked out about when the horses because it's great big creatures.
Yeah, they thought the conquistadors were one creature.
Really?
Another guy.
Oh, it's something
They
that.
actually let them run off.
The largest domesticated animal that the Americans had before they were created was the llama. The llama. Not a great beast of burden, huh? So let's take a look at this slave trade thing again. The slave trade wasn't new. Most human societies all the way back to the beginning of history have had slaves. Even the Africans had slaves. But we got to understand that there was something that made the Atlantic, excuse me, I know you guys are just praying with me. There are some things that make the Atlantic slave trade unique. Where did most slaves come from? Not this particular, I mean, in general, where did most slaves come from? No, I'm not talking about, how'd they get acquired by boat? Oh, wait. I said, I'm not talking about the Atlantic slave trade, I'm talking about all slave trade.
They were conquered people.
They were conquered people. These guys are going to war against these guys, they beat them, and they go, okay, well, you guys got to come here as slaves. $95% of slaves, that's how they became slaves. There were cases, in Rome you could do it, in Greece you could do it, or if you needed money, you could sell your kid.
That never actually happened.
It sure did.
Yeah,
And I've got.
In Europe,
it happens.
sure they still do it now.
Well, I know that it happens today, but I've never heard of it like, well, no, okay, I've never really heard it done when you're a kid.
They do it in servitude too for the kings and everything else.
Yeah.
In China, they
Yeah,
do it.
Yeah,
they
cut their balls
a lot of times, I mean, it wasn't real common. Here I am, a great guy, and I'm in need of money, and I got a couple extra kids, I'll sell one.
Yeah, honey, just pop out another one so we can sell that one on the black market too.
Well, they're looking on the black market.
And you know,
Right?
I will tell you, it happens more often today than you think it is.
I didn't know
The
that.
trade in human traffics today is so scary. It is scary.
Okay, human trafficking, that's deeper.
Same thing.
Not really.
Most of the people involved in human trafficking are under the age of 20.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I thought they were kidnapped or something. I didn't know that. That's crazy.
In some cases, becoming a quote slave was voluntary. There were situations in places like Egypt where you could go and say, you know, I think I can be a slave at the palace. And for non-Egyptians, in some dynasties, it was a way of upward mobility. Because they would train you, and if you could work your way up, and you became a scribe, you were pretty high up in society. Of course, guys, if you got the guy to guard the harem, they did something else too.
Yep.
Raise your voice a little bit. The Atlantic slave trade was entirely different for a whole lot of reasons. The first one, of course, is that the slaves were captured to be slaves. No other reason. Generally, the way it worked would be that mostly the coastal tribes in Africa would go into the interior, capture the slaves, bring them back, and sell them to the people involved in the slave trade. The most active were the Dutch, followed very, very closely by the English. Somewhere around 90% of the slaves that were captured in Africa did not come to North America. They went to Brazil and the Caribbean and whatnot. Another big difference in the African slave trade was that if you were captured and you became a slave, you were a slave until you died, and your offspring were also slaves. Actually, by about somewhere around 1700, maybe a little later than that, maybe 1750, we had enough slaves in the United States, we didn't need to import anymore. And the slave trade itself, is the Atlantic slave trade for the colonies anyway, fell off because we didn't need the slaves before, because there were not being born here. So, yo,
I was gonna say it's kind of like a caste system, right? How you're born into it.
a lot worse than that.
Yeah.
At least in the caste system, you were born. To my knowledge, there was never a slave caste.
But you're born into it.
But you're born into it, and you don't get out of it. Yeah. The only means of manumission were if somebody would buy your freedom, or in some cases, owners of slaves would grant manumission, usually to some loyal slave after a lifetime or something like that. They were pretty rare. Guys, slaves were expensive. And here's a major difference that we still, no doubt about it, has repercussions today. You know, if I'm a Spartan and I go to work with the Minoans down the block, and I can't win and capture a bunch of Minoans and take them back, they pretty much look just like I do, don't they? But in the Atlantic slave trade, the people that were captured and enslaved were not skin color. And so even if you managed to gain freedom, you were still marked. It happened all the time. Even, you know, I mean, if you were a freed slave in 1800, man, I mean, you didn't go anywhere without your papers. And even if you had your papers, chances were very good that somebody's just going to pick you up and sell you again.
That'd be for real.
Sure.
You're walking down the lane like you stop.
No.
You're still waiting, huh? I like your attitude. So slavery in the New World was totally different from any slavery that had ever been encountered by human beings before. In North America, most of the slaves went to the south. And of course, the rest of them went to Brazil and whatnot. Very few slaves in the north. And that didn't last very long. How come? They didn't need them. Slaves are expensive, and I got this 10-acre plot out there. I haven't got money for slaves. I haven't got room for them. I haven't got anything else for them. They didn't need them. They needed them where they were growing very labor-intensive crops, and of course, sugar and cotton, and eventually tobacco in some areas, as labor-intensive as it gets. And I think there are a lot of northerners who consider they're superior because they didn't have slavery up here. Yeah, because you couldn't afford them. You didn't need them. Yeah. And when we start getting into abolitionists and William Lloyd Garrison and all those guys, these guys were all for freeing the slaves, You sure didn't want to come north? You sure didn't want that?
Were some of the reasons the owners and stuff.
Yes.
But they were nice.
You ever Uncle Tom's Cabin?
Huh?
You ever read Uncle Tom's Cabin? Who was the evil guy? Simon Legree? And he was a northerner. If you've read it and recall, he was a northerner. So if you find yourself in slavery in the Americas, you have almost no possibility of manumission. You're going to be a slave for the rest of your life, and your children are going to be slaves for the rest of their lives. You don't look like everybody else. It's real hard to escape. You have absolutely no rights. Shortly before the Civil War, there was one of the absolute worst decisions that the United States Supreme Court handed down involving Governor Dred Scott. I mean, this is even worse than Americans United, guys. Well, that was great. I'm telling you, man, those justices are in the back room smoking something. Where's Sandra? Anyway, Roger Taney was the Chief Justice involved. As I said, it was shortly before the Civil War broke out, and it was actually set up as a test case. You guys know what I mean when I say test case? It's almost like civil disobedience. We're going to break this law, take it to court, and see if we can get the law overturned. Dred Scott was a slave who was owned by a guy named Sanford. And Sanford was an abolitionist. But the reason that he was the owner of Dred Scott was because they were going to set up this test case. The test case ended up being known as Sanford versus Scott. Mr. Sanford took Mr. Scott to Illinois for a couple of years to establish that. And then, said, come on, Dred, we're going to go back to Missouri. And as I said, this was all set up. And Mr. Scott said, I don't think I can go. I like this freedom stuff because Illinois is a free state. And so it went to court. When it got to the Supreme Court, the Chief Justice, Roger Taney, that bastion of civil rights, ruled, first of all, ruled against Scott. Said, no, you have to go back. You were his property. Ruled that because you are not a citizen, you have no right in court in the first place. And then he turned around and he said, and besides that, you don't even own your own body. What are you doing in my courtroom? That gives you an idea of what the status of slaves was in the United States. An incredible man by the name of Frederick Douglass. He escaped, came north, made enough money that he went back and fought his freedom. came back up north, got quite an education. And it's Morgan Freeman doing one of his speeches. Oh man, is it powerful. And he starts out and he says, I come to you tonight as a thief. I stole these arms and these legs. I stole this body from my owner. Wow, is that powerful? So, I will go back to exactly what I said when we started talking about this. The slave trade in the Americas, the African slave trade, was totally different from any other kind of slave trade. Of course, another thing it was, eventually, was extremely divisive.
How much was it to buy your own freedom back then?
Whatever your master said it was going to cost you. Remember, he owned you, he sets price.
But he escaped. He still sold it.
He escaped, went up and made enough money. You're talking about Douglas?
Yeah.
Made enough money to where his mindset said, I'm not going to go through life being a thief. Went back down. Probably respect for the law, I think. Went back down and bought his freedom after he made enough money. And he wasn't the only one. A number of slaves did that. But most of them, of course, even after the Civil War, we're going to find that, well, guess what, guys? You're free. Have a good life. Oh, now what do I do? And actually, what we see is the development of sharecropping, which is almost as bad as slavery. So it really is. I mean, it was an incredibly brutal institution. And remember, I owned you. I could do anything I wanted to you. If you pissed me off, I could cut off your arm or kill you. I owned you. Just like a horse or a cow. And for the most part, that was the way I considered you. It's just another piece of livestock.
You think that the reason that when the slaves went back to their owners to purchase their freedom, that most of them were able to do so is, the slave owners like that, well, as long as you gave me enough money so I can afford to essentially replace you, go get another slave, then, what does it really matter?
They were making their own.
They already escaped anyways, yeah. Take the money.
Yeah. I don't know.
Just taking money.
I mean, they came back and they essentially paid to replace themselves.
I don't know. I can't answer that. I suppose, there were probably a lot of emotional decisions made, a lot of other things.
But a lot of it was, things were changing and people looked down on slavery.
They were not the South.
But I mean, it's hard, we're gearing up to the Civil War, so you have all these other people saying, oh, that's not a good thing. That's not a
We'll
good
start the Republican
and
Party
sort
and all
of,
that.
social pressures.
Well, the other thing too, to be
They
able
didn't care what the North thought.
to be able to be a slave, in a free state, and not have that runaway status, be like, no, I'm a free slave or whatever. Here's my papers. That that was more beneficial for them than it was for anybody else.
Yeah. One of the things we have to understand when we start approaching a civil war in the United States is that we've been putting band-aids on this problem since we wrote the Constitution. And what we were trying to do was keep it from exploding until we could find a solution for it. And we didn't. We didn't. And the South was fighting more than Civil War. The South was not only fighting for a belief system, they were fighting for their very existence. If you remove slavery from antebellum Southern culture, you destroy the culture. because the entire economy is based on slavery. The economy and the South cannot exist without slavery.
But isn't that a silly way to look at it? Because I mean, today the concepts that you have to pay everybody to more slaves, obviously it still works. So even back then, it would just put a damper on their profit margin. Is all. You pay them a couple pennies or whatever. Like, would it really ruin them?
And it did.
Because they're making so much money.
It did. I mean, even today, 2012, the South is behind the North as a direct result of losing slavery. It's not nearly as bad as it was. But you take during Reconstruction and everything, the South was a occupied military area. That was the one that kept it going.
And even after they lost, there were still like regiments that were still fighting, and wasn't that true? And like people that still
Well,
wouldn't.
there were actually some battles that happened after Appomattox, but they were real scattered. The thing is, by the time Lee surrendered, there wasn't much left of the Confederate Army.
And some people would relinquish their slaves, right?
Everybody did.
Well, no, they had to, but there were some people that were still trying to fight for their own slaves, for their own little.
They were just
farm.
killing them, shooting them.
How we had the Civil War already? Remember in 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which did absolutely nothing. It did a lot psychologically, but what the proclamation did was it freed all the slaves in the states in rebellion. Oh boy, that's gonna, and you see this guy in Georgia going, oh boy, guess I better free all my slaves. And we're in the middle of the Civil War. Really didn't have any effect. However, as soon as the second that Lee surrendered, the proclamation had the effect of law in the southern states.
And it could be enforced.
And could be
And that was
enforced.
the-
So as a result, we had a 13th Amendment that it says that it freed all the slaves. It was actually an Emancipation Proclamation that freed the slaves. It was the 13th Amendment that made slavery illegal.
But the slaves were expensive, so were the plantation owners compensated for that, or is it just like, oh, well, that's it?
There were some attempts, but they were few and far between.
Because I imagine they had like hundreds of slaves on some plantations.
The thing is that, of all the slaves in the South, they were owned by by very few people. And very, very few people owned a couple of slaves. Almost everybody owned a couple of hundred slaves. And what we see developing in the South, how did we get on the Civil War? What we see in the South is a development of a society very similar to what we had in the Middle Ages in Europe, a feudal society, where the real power was with the plantation owners. And a very, very strict social system with the plantation owners at the top. Come on, state governors and people like that. They didn't even matter. And then we would have, and the funny thing about it is when we look at, people they were referred to as poor white trash. They were some of the greatest supporters of the South and slavery. How come? There we go. Because they may have been at the bottom of the heap with the white guys, but there was a whole another half the heap below them. And then who owns that status?
So they were willing to fight and die for it just so that they wouldn't be.
If they lost that status, there's a good possibility they might become slaves.
The class structure was incredibly strong in any developed South. And as I said, they had guys who were these plantation owners. They were unbelievably wealthy. And they pretty much ran their plantation the way they wanted. And it worked just like the feudal system that we saw in Europe. The plantations were self-sufficient.
Isn't that where the concepts pretty much came from?
Off the top of my head, I'd say no. I'd say it was a natural development. Yeah, I don't think the guys in the South went, ooh, look what they did in Europe, let's do that. It's just kind of a natural development. So was feudalism in Europe. You know, nobody really planned feudalism. We sat down and wrote a book that said how to plan a feudal society.
Right.
Yeah, it was more of a natural development. And that's what it was in the South. But even the black structure was very, very class sensitive. You know, some slaves went to foremen. You know, they still had it bad. And then the house slaves were usually up to the right. And it was the field slaves. A lot of them. And you did not want to be a field slave. Of course, my take on the matter is, see, I can't imagine what this might be like. Do not have your freedom. You know, no matter how bad things get, I can always pick up and leave.
I don't think anybody today can really comprehend.
I don't either.
Like one, they might think they can, but I don't be a slave, man. I think it's still worse though, because even in prison.
Oh, by far.
Doing it for playing Xbox.
No, I agree with you. I don't think there is any way that you can appreciate the status of slavery unless you have experienced it. I don't think there's any way to really understand it.
12-hour days, not a lot to eat, but.
Well,
I don't know. I wasn't there, I'm guessing.
dawn to dusk.
Without you like, didn't they like, I don't know if it's true or not, but they would say, like, my friend used to tell me that, like, slaves used to get, like some big bread or something, like, so they could be, like, strong and big, and that's why, that's why a lot of black people nowadays are big and strong.
Some of the owners did that.
Like breeding, yeah.
Yeah, just like breeding another animal.
Really, I never heard that.
Yeah,
that's true.
Or have you ever seen that Mandigo? That's a movie about the slave trade and stuff like that. It's huge. And he sleeps with his owner's wife.
Yeah.
And what she said,
I think it's a mutual thing.
Well, no, I'm just saying, like, he was like, I can't do this to them. But I don't do it.
Well, bear in mind that if you were a slave in the South, you lost your humanity. You weren't even considered human. You were considered property, like a horse or a cow or a pig. And I don't believe anybody can imagine what that would be like unless you're there. After the Civil War, they set up a lot of programs. One was called 40 Acres and a Mule. They would give former slaves 40 acres and a mule. And not very many slaves took advantage of that. Actually, it was a limited program anyway. And probably one of the reasons was that, you know, well, put out a bunch of flyers, let them know about it. Well, I didn't want to do it. It was a capital offense in some areas to teach you slavery, right?
That's all. That's terrible.
It was a capital offense. But you know what? I imagine something else. I'm one of these guys, and I really try to walk a mile in the other mountains. And of course, sometimes it's absolutely impossible. But I think of myself, okay, I've just gained my freedom. You mean I can go where I want to go? Oh, I gotta play with this for a while. And so many of them just went out on what the Australians call walkabouts. A lot of them came west. If you look at the true history of the West, Colorado, everything else, boy, I'll tell you what, the blacks play a lot bigger role than most people give credit for. I mean, look at guys like Tim Beckwith, one of the greatest guys we had around here, one of the biggies. All I can say is we're getting better. We're getting better every day. But slavery in the United States was so controversial and such an immense, it was like the elephant in the room, that when these guys are in Philadelphia in 1787, compromising themselves right and left, the whole Constitution's compromised, they never got it done. If they hadn't, they hit slavery, and they went, we can't even talk about it. And 70 years later, we've been putting Band-Aid after Band-Aid after Band-Aid on it. So it was such a serious issue that when they were writing the Constitution, they wrote into the Constitution, we're not going to talk about this for 30 years. And then later on, we get a Civil War. And Civil War, if you think about it, is the ultimate conflict. Because it's two people or two groups in the same nation. Yeah.
Wasn't the start of the Civil War to keep the Union whole?
Yeah.
2 years into it became.
Yeah. Well, it's actually okay.
It was just slavery.
No, it wasn't.
Um,
The first 2 years of the Civil War were to keep the Union as a whole because they were starting to
They
divide.
want it separate.
Lincoln was a smart cookie. And this Civil War problem had been brewing for a long time. And a lot of it had to do with what they call states' rights, which is not even a correct term. States have powers, people have rights. But anyway, we'll call it states' rights because Newt Gingrich does. We almost had a civil war in the Jackson administration. And it was over states' rights. There was a Supreme Court ruling that went against Georgia and said, no, the federal government takes precedence here. And Jackson was against states' rights. And he was, we're still talking about John Marshall, second Supreme Court Justice, been there forever, definitely the most influential. And his court rules against Georgia. And Andrew Jackson, the President of the United States, says, well, Mr. Marshall has his ruling, now let's see him enforce it. Wow. There's almost a civil war right there. We go through the Compromise of 1820, Missouri Compromise. Every time there's a southern state admitted, there's got to be a northern state admitted too, to make sure that there's a balance. At one point, it gets so vicious that there's a guy in the Senate named Charles Sumner. And he stands up and he denounces slavery. And there's a guy in the House that takes umbrage because he thinks he's insulted his family. He walks onto the floor of the Senate the next day and canes Senator Sumner, almost kills him. On the floor of the Senate. And originally, when Lincoln is running for president, Lincoln's pretty moderate. He really is pretty moderate. But the South does not see it that way. And Lincoln has said, my primary purpose is to maintain the Union. Now it's a question not of federal precedence, but it becomes a question of secession. We voluntarily joined the Union, but is it like the Hotel California, where you can check out anytime you like, but you can never leave? Well, it turns out, thanks to the Civil War, it is the Hotel California. But we hadn't settled that question yet. So Lincoln says, I don't care what it takes to preserve the Union. If by freeing all the slaves, I can preserve the Union, I'll do it that way. If I can preserve it by not freeing one slave, I'll do it that way. Slavery is not the issue. Union is the issue. When Lincoln is indeed elected, and he by far is not given a